So welcome everyone to the Metrics International Forum. The forum is organized by the Meta Research Innovation Center at Stanford, or short Metrics, and the center is directed by John Ioannidis and Steve Goodman, and we are a research group and fellowship program dedicated to finding ways to improve the validity and transparency of scientific research. I'm Mick Siebert, a postdoc at Metrics, and I will be today's moderator. All of our international forums are recorded and can be accessed on our website. Please keep your questions until the end, or write them in the chat during the presentation. Our presenter today is Iain Hrynaszkiewicz. Iain is responsible for PLOS goals to increase adoption of open science practices and understand and increase the benefits of adopting open science. This includes, but is not limited to, PLOS policies and initiatives relating to posting preprints, sharing research data, sharing code, and sharing methods and protocols. Iain was previously head of data publishing at Springer Nature and has worked in various roles at F1000 and Biomed Central. He has published numerous peer-reviewed papers and book chapters related to various aspects of open science. So if you're ready, Iain, we can start.
Thanks very much, Max, and thanks everybody for listening today and listening online afterwards. I was saying to Max at the start, I almost feel guilty that I didn't know about this forum before. I found out about it after receiving the invitation and have bookmarked a number of the previous presentations. So yeah, I'm pleased to be included in the group of people that have presented here. So I don't need to tell you too much about what I do at PLOS because Max has already done that. So I'll get started on telling you a bit about some research that we've conducted and recently shared as a preprint. So I'll just advance the slides. Yeah. So very briefly, the context for this piece of research is research assessment or reform of research assessment. Unsurprisingly, at PLOS and elsewhere, we see how researchers are assessed, incentivized and rewarded as a fundamental barrier to wider adoption of open, transparent, rigorous and reproducible research practices. And as most of people in this audience no doubt know, numerous initiatives calling for and working on reform of research assessment have emerged, some shown on this slide. These include COARA, Coalition for Advancing Research Assessment, San Francisco Declaration on Research Assessment, which is around a decade old now. But these tend to have certain elements in common. These include focusing on the intrinsic qualities of research outputs rather than extrinsic factors or proxies, notably the journal impact factor. Also recognizing a more diverse array of research outputs and activities and how research is assessed. Also highlighting the importance of qualitative judgments around like peer review, for example, and also really importantly, responsible use of quantitative metrics, in particular, thinking about the role of rankings. However, despite, in some cases for many years, calls for action on research assessment reform, the journal impact factor, GIF, in particular, continues to be used in research assessment and appears in guidelines for academic promotion and tenure. One possible explanation for this is that, or its continued use in this setting, is that most assessment exercises are conducted under time constraints, such that research evaluators must fall back on convenient proxies for the characteristics of research that they are charged with evaluating. And the journal impact factor and other extrinsic factors, such as journal, author, or institution reputation, tend to be such proxies, even if they don't really represent the characteristics of research that assessors really want to know when they assess that research. And we wanted to find out more about what is happening here. Before the current piece of survey research that I'm going to talk more about, there was some intentionally preceding research, which is also available as a preprint. So back in 2020, with support from the Sloan Foundation, to better understand how researchers assess credibility and impact of research in different contexts, we conducted interviews with 52 cell biology researchers. We reasoned that more precisely characterizing researchers' attitudes and what they are trying to achieve when they participate in research assessment exercises we reasoned that that would provide insights that would help us improve how those assessments are made. For example, publishers, we're interested in more clearly signaling elements of our processes that inform or could inform credibility and trustworthiness judgments. University administrators or funders, research funders may be interested in refining their instructions to reviewers who are often making high stakes decisions about the distribution of professional rewards. Now, the 52 interviews that we conducted enabled us to design the survey that I'm going to talk about shortly. And the survey quantifies a subset of the very rich findings that came from those interviews. The methodology that we use both in the interviews and in the survey is informed by an approach called jobs to be done theory, specifically an approach known as outcome-driven innovation, which is more commonly used in product or business innovation. Following this approach, we conceptualize the assessment of research as a job that the researcher is trying to complete. And through the interviews, we created a detailed job map of the various stages of this job and determined in a lot of detail the desired outcomes or goals that researchers are trying to achieve when they're assessing outputs. And what's on the slide here is a generic version of this map that you can download from various places on the internet. So examples more specifically of what are those desired outcomes that might relate to credibility assessment are things like, and these are things we heard in our interviews, understand if data support the conclusions, understand the experimental design, understand the validity of a statistical analysis, or minimize the time it takes to understand publication credibility. A key finding in our interviews was that desired outcomes or goals relating to credibility assessment and impact assessment were equally prevalent when researchers are assessing research, when they're serving on committees, research assessment committees for hiring, promotion, or giving grants or reviewing grants. So this was particularly interesting because despite a strong focus of a lot of guidelines that we've seen for research assessment tends to be on impact, but assessing credibility or trustworthiness, as terms sometimes used, seems to be equally important. Another equally important finding from the interviews was, which also reflects previous research, is there is a lack of common definitions for credibility. Researchers in our interviews often referred to concepts of credibility, quality, reputation, prestige, and impact, sometimes in interchangeable and sometimes circular ways. So from those interviews, we generated 3 hypotheses to test in the survey. So those were, first, that credibility is important in the committee context. We wanted to quantify that more than we could through the interviews. So the credibility defined as evaluating the credibility of a candidate's research outputs being very important or extremely important to most researchers in the sample. Second hypothesis is that the needs around assessing credibility are not very well satisfied. So what we mean by that is that researchers are dissatisfied with their ability to actually make these credibility judgments. Thirdly, we hypothesized that assessments of credibility do not use optimal methods, and that a majority of researchers in the sample would be using inappropriate proxies, which I'll tell you about shortly, to evaluate credibility in that context. So a bit more detail on the survey design, again, informed by that jobs to be done theory, outcome-driven innovation, and those interviews. So we really had to try and address this problem of a lack of standardized definitions for credibility or exclusive definitions for credibility. And we constructed the survey to ask about different overlapping and partially redundant aspects of credibility that surfaced during our interviews. So to give you an example, an aspect of credibility or a way that credibility was expressed is to evaluate if research is trustworthy or reliable, or evaluate if research is credible, sort of different interchangeable definitions, to try and address this problem that it's a concept that doesn't have a standard definition. What we also did, although it wasn't strictly germane to our hypotheses, we included some questions on impact as a comparator to the credibility questions to reduce the potential for impact considerations to be confounded with credibility judgments. So our aim was to elicit data on one, what participants are assessing, i.e. what are the aspects of credibility that they're assessing. And two, we wanted to understand, better quantify what they're trying to accomplish during the assessment of a specific piece of research or a specific research output, i.e. the goals or the outcomes being pursued. So an example of one, the aspect of credibility is to evaluate whether research is reliable and trustworthy. An example of a specific goal or outcome is to evaluate if the conclusions are well supported. So with this outcome-driven approach, which you'll see in the results, the survey queried both the importance of these aspects or these tasks, these goals, and also queried the level of satisfaction with the respondents' ability to complete that task. So in contrast to earlier studies that we're aware of, this approach clearly distinguishes the goals the researchers are trying to achieve, their desired outcomes, from the solutions they are presently using to try to achieve those outcomes. So by focusing on researchers' goals as opposed to their current practices, we can better understand how we might transform those practices, potentially offering better solutions to achieve the same goals. So we've used this survey design previously in peer-reviewed studies because it allows analysis of areas of opportunity for new tools or solutions or interventions, in particular where the importance of a task is high, but the level of satisfaction with the ability to complete it is low. So things that appear in the green quadrant here are what are considered the best opportunities for new solutions, new ways of doing things. We also, in the survey, asked questions about researchers' commonly used approaches for assessing credibility. And this was to test if researchers may be subjectively satisfied with methods that are objectively ineffective for assessing the intrinsic qualities of the credibility of research, like the journal impact factor. So the response options in this particular question are in this table here, and we intentionally included methods that were focused on the intrinsic factors of that particular research output that were mentioned frequently in our one-to-one interviews, but we also included on the right-hand side 3 proxies that we might consider inappropriate for evaluating the credibility of a particular research output, because these proxies are extrinsic to the research output. They are thinking about the journal reputation or the journal impact factor or the reputation of a person or their lab rather than the particular research output. All the data anonymized in the survey instrument are available from the link there. So moving on to the results, we received 485 completed survey responses from all areas of, or respondents in all areas of biology. We actually sent more than 176,000 unique emails. But we also asked some other organizations to distribute the survey for us, and also it was shared on social media. So we don't have a completely accurate response rate, but you can derive an approximate one from what's there. 77% of the responses came from those emails that PLOS sent. We had 43% of respondents from the EU, 38% from the US, and 61% of them were men. Unsurprisingly, most respondents had quite a lot of experience, 16 years or more, because in part, one of the screening questions was that the respondents had to have served on assessment committee in the last 2 years in order to qualify for the survey. So in the survey, it's not shown on this slide here, but one of the first questions was to actually confirm that researchers do evaluate different research outputs, that is peer-reviewed publications, data, code, preprints, protocols, with they do actually do that in the research assessment context. And one key thing is that publications, peer-reviewed publications, are the most important in that context to evaluate. It's, unsurprisingly, peer-reviewed publications, the dominant output of assessment. So, but in relation to our first hypothesis about the importance of assessing credibility in committees, we asked about the importance of 6 different aspects of credibility. Just to remind you, we had to ask about it in different ways. to ensure that we were using terminology that would be familiar to respondents. So when assessing research outputs, all aspects of credibility that we asked about were very or extremely important to more than half of respondents. And the aspects of credibility that rated highest in terms of their importance are evaluating if research is trustworthy or reliable, evaluating if research is credible, and evaluating if research is well designed. We also asked at the bottom another question about impact as well, which is colored differently to give you some comparison there. We also asked about credibility related goals, those desired outcomes, and what's slightly more specific, to understand what researchers were trying to accomplish or the tasks they're trying to complete when they're assessing credibility in a committee context. And similarly, all the credibility related goals that we tested are considered very important by a majority of researchers when assessing the candidate's research outputs. The most important ones you can see here are evaluating if conclusions are well supported, if there are signs of fabrication, falsification, plagiarism, and if research methods are sound. So that's the importance of assessing credibility and associated goals. What about satisfaction with their ability to complete these tasks, the responsibility to evaluate these aspects of credibility? So this is our second hypothesis. Most respondents were in some not very satisfied with their ability to evaluate various aspects of credibility. For each aspect, fewer than 50% are very or extremely satisfied. Researchers are most satisfied with ability to evaluate if well designed, and least satisfied with evaluating if research was conducted ethically. Similarly, thinking about those more specific assessment goals, we're also seeing generally low satisfaction with the ability to complete most of these tasks, mirroring what we're seeing in the aspects of assessment. The task with the lowest level of satisfaction was to evaluate if there are signs of fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. And still with the results, in relation to our third and final hypothesis, the survey asked respondents what methods they normally use to evaluate each of the 6 aspects of credibility. Methods presented as response options, again, were derived from and expressed according to the terminology used by interviewed researchers in the previous study. And so these methods, just to remind you, included things like reviewing figures, reviewing methods, reviewing related publications, and outputs associated with open science practices, so whether data or code or peer reviews were shared. And they also included those 3 less suitable proxies for assessing an individual output, which is shown on the slide here: author reputation, lab reputation, journal reputation, journal impact factor. And we found that more than half, 57% of respondents reported normally using at least one of the 3 inappropriate proxies to evaluate if research is credible. So moving on to some interpretation, it seems that even researchers who would prefer not to might often have to rely on these unsuitable, inappropriate proxies due to a lack of better options, perhaps. It's worth pointing out that for any given aspect of credibility, only 1 to 2% of researchers in our sample reported relying exclusively on inappropriate proxies. While most researchers appear to use inappropriate proxies alongside other methods, the prevalence of these in research assessment context indicates that other methods or tools for assessment alone don't appear to be fulfilling evaluation needs. So, for example, 1 in 5 of respondents used journal impact factor when evaluating if research is credible, and 15% of them used it when evaluating if research is trustworthy or reliable. Moreover, the real number might, of course, be higher, as many researchers might be hesitant to admit relying on journal impact factor just due to social desirability bias in the survey. Our survey results confirmed this lack of standardized definitions on concepts like credibility, trustworthiness, quality, or impact, which we'd already observed in our interviews and had already been observed in previous research. But we were able to confirm that most of the aspects importance ratings were moderately correlated with research is credible, although none were strongly correlated. This is actually taken from supplementary table 2, but I thought rather than being in the preprint itself, but I thought this was interesting to show. What we think this means is that participants' definition of credible is both variable across these aspects of assessment. So while this was quite challenging for designing the survey, the lack of agreement on what credible research is, we think points to a broader problem, in that it's hard to assess something that's ill-defined or interpreted in many different ways. However, the results suggest that these notions related to credibility are distinct from those related to impact, and further suggest that different aspects of credibility and trustworthiness are valued differently by researchers. Which leads us to table 3 in the preprint, or an excerpt of it, which I'm showing here, which I think is perhaps the most interesting part of the paper. So having observed that assessing credibility is important, and that researchers' needs for assessing credibility are not very well satisfied currently, we wanted to understand where the most acute needs or opportunities might be, potentially for better assessment solutions. So to do this, we employed this jobs to be done theory outcome-driven innovation methodology that I've mentioned, which entails quantifying or plotting the gap between importance and satisfaction ratings. We did this for 3 sets of sub-questions. So those that looked at respondents' ability to evaluate different aspects of assessment. So, for example, research was conducted ethically. Also, the questions related to the different assessment goals. So, example of that is to check if there are signs of fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism. And also questions related to respondents' ability to assess different kinds of research outputs. For example, evaluate if a preprint is credible. So this is an excerpt from table 3 showing where some of the biggest gaps are. And the greatest gaps between importance and satisfaction appear to relate to what we might label issues of research integrity, with signs of fabrication, falsification, or plagiarism appearing at the top there. So put another way, and going back to that graphic I showed earlier, if we were to plot these differences on this graph, they would all appear in this top left quadrant. And so this would be very exciting if we were in the process of designing a new product or solution for research assessment, because there appears to be a big opportunity for new solutions. The majority of research assessment activities we asked about in our survey are both important, or very, or extremely important, and what we might call underserved. That is, user satisfaction with their ability to complete these tasks is low, suggesting big opportunities for new solutions. And by solution here, I mean, I intentionally use that vague term. It could be anything within reason. It could be guidelines. It could be policy. It could be training. It could be qualitative assessment. It could be checklists. It could be artificial intelligence or some other digital tool. Like, so we didn't seek to specify a solution really to characterize the problem. The emergence of research integrity issues, as most important here, might reflect recent scandals in the peer-reviewed literature, such as image manipulation, predatory publishing, and paper mills. This finding seems particularly novel, and suggests that those assessing research now need additional signals of credibility beyond simple assurance that outputs have been peer-reviewed or appeared in the peer-reviewed journal. So publishers and other organizations or pieces of infrastructure like preprint servers, for example, that conduct checks for some of these integral questions could perhaps signal the results of these checks, or the contents of these checks, or the nature of these checks more explicitly at the article or research output level. Importantly, signals would need to be at least as convenient as the less appropriate proxies currently serving this function, such that researchers would be intrinsically motivated to adopt them in these time-constrained research assessment contexts. With the support of various automated technologies, including artificial intelligence, machine learning, natural language processing, choose your preferred term, it's now possible to efficiently evaluate certain characteristics of research articles or outputs related to transparency. One example of this from PLOS is that we've been looking to characterize open science practices, or what we've been calling open science indicators, using new technologies as part of an initiative called Open Science Indicators to provide more information on data, code, preprint sharing. And I should note that this effort is in part inspired by preceding meta-research efforts to quantify transparency indicators in the literature, such as the paper from Sergio et al. On the right, and the Charité metrics dashboard, which is continuing to do very interesting work. Relatedly, others have automated the evaluation of compliance with things like reporting guidelines as well. However, I think it's important to acknowledge that many of these efforts focus on transparency of data and code rather than the qualities of those outputs, or perhaps issues of integrity and reproducibility. But I think it would be reasonable to assume that the former may be a reasonable proxy for the latter. I think further research could explore the extent to which some of these newer signals of transparency or credibility obtained through these processes could actually improve assessment of credibility in those research assessment contexts. So a couple of thoughts on open science practices specifically, and by open science practices, I mean things like sharing data, code, preprints, protocols. So in the survey, and to be candid really about some of our initial motivations for all of this work, is in our interviews and survey, we were particularly interested in the extent to which participants examined research outputs associated with open science practices, so things like data, code, preprints, as well as peer-reviewed publications. And our previous interviews revealed that open science practices sometimes form part of credibility judgments. However, our survey results highlight the dominant importance of peer-reviewed publications in research assessment over these other outputs. So this is consistent with previous research concluding that peer review is a central criterion in determining whether people engage with scholarly content. Here we show that examining open science outputs is seen as very important for a smaller percentage of participants compared to peer-reviewed articles, but it still appears to be a substantive percentage. So 56% of participants considered it very or extremely important to examine data sets, a smaller percentage to examine protocols, code, and preprints. This lower level of engagement with open science outputs or activities might be a product of the lack of visibility of open science in academic job descriptions and hiring processes, and by the lack of consistency among publishers, perhaps, in whether and how these outputs are made accessible alongside published articles. Final couple of slides just on the limitations. So it's not clear that what we found is applicable beyond the context of grant review and hiring and or promotion committees in the biological sciences. Our respondents might not be representative of all biology researchers who have served on committees due to the convenient sampling approach used to recruit participants. We also, just to remind you, had a high percentage of PLOS affiliated respondents, and by affiliated I mean people on editorial boards, authors, served as a peer reviewer, etc. Responsive of these PLOS affiliates to questions related to importance did not differ from those unaffiliated with PLOS, but the former tended to rate satisfaction higher than PLOS, people not affiliated with PLOS. These differences was only statistically significant for only one question, and sort of details of how we looked at that are in the publicly available supplementary tables and analyses. Like many surveys, social desirability bias is another potential limitation. And participants might have been influenced throughout the survey if they thought that they perhaps should be more invested in the importance of evaluating credibility or in using particular methods for doing so. Many, for instance, may have underplayed how they use inappropriate proxies like journal impact factor. So in terms of our conclusions, all three of our hypotheses were validated. So that is, we found assessing credibility of candidates' research outputs in assessment committees is very important to most researchers. We found that researchers' needs around assessing credibility are not very well satisfied. And we also found that assessments of credibility do not use optimal methods, with most researchers, 57%, using at least one proxy related to extrinsic characteristics such as author or lab reputation, journal reputation, or journal impact factor to evaluate if research is credible, a practice that research assessment performers and many others perhaps consider to be problematic. Our observations suggest opportunities to improve research assessment processes. The reductive approach of using a single metric or a small set of metric is inadequate to assess research and researcher quality, and it's dangerous in contexts where time pressure allows simple metrics to dominate judgment. Our results suggest that there is a large area of opportunity to provide signals of credibility and trustworthiness, particularly around research integrity and the rigor of research. So we infer that new solutions would be welcomed by researchers participating in research assessment committees, because our respondents consider credibility and trustworthiness to be very important, but are dissatisfied with current means of assessing these qualities with the tools at their disposal. But I think it's important to note that any new solution that one might try to use would need to be convenient and easy to use if it is to supplant the pervasive use of these extrinsic proxies like journal impact factor. Future research, we think, could seek to further define and test new signals or new solutions for their ability to meet assessors' needs and hopefully improve assessment processes. So finally, just quickly the acknowledgements. So I'm presenting this on behalf of my co-authors. The citation for the preprint is available there. It's currently undergoing peer review at a journal. This current work didn't receive any external funding, but the interviews that I described were supported in part by a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, and also to acknowledge some researchers at University of Melbourne who provided some really useful feedback on the initial research design and a survey instrument. And I think I can open for questions now. Thank you for listening, everybody.